The Ghostly Highwayman. Hello friends, welcome to the Horror Ghost Stories. The story begins. On a desolate stretch of road, deep in the moors, there was a legend that had haunted the small village for centuries. It was said that on certain nights, when the fog rolled in thick and the moon hid behind dark clouds, the ghost of a highwayman could be seen riding along the road, his silhouette illuminated only by the flickering lights of lanterns. His name was Blackthorn, and his tale was as tragic as it was terrifying. Blackthorn had been a notorious highwayman in life, known for robbing travelers and nobles alike. His face, hidden beneath a mask, struck fear into anyone who dared cross his path. But it wasn't greed or the thrill of the crime that drove him, it was a desperate need to provide for his beloved, a woman named Eleanor, whom he had promised to marry. Yet fate was cruel. In a twist of fate, Blackthorn was betrayed by one of his own. On the night of his most daring heist, he was ambushed by soldiers, and despite his skill with the blade, he was overpowered. The last thing he saw before his life was stolen from him was Eleanor, standing in the distance, crying for him. He had died that night, his heart broken and his spirit consumed by rage. The villagers claimed that Blackthorn's ghost now roamed the road, seeking vengeance on anyone unlucky enough to be caught in the fog. They said he was cursed to forever ride, a phantom figure with no purpose but to torment the living. One cold autumn night, a young traveler named Thomas found himself journeying along that very road. His lantern was his only guide as the thick mist enveloped him, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. He had heard the stories, of course, but dismissed them as mere superstition. After all, he was an educated man, a scholar, and no ghost could possibly exist in his rational world. But as the minutes ticked by, and the air grew colder, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. His horse snorted nervously, tugging at the reins, as though sensing something unseen. Thomas tried to reassure himself that it was just the chill of the night playing tricks on his mind. The sound of hooves began to echo through the mist. At first, it was distant, but it grew louder, approaching swiftly. His heart raced, and he turned to look over his shoulder. There, emerging from the fog, was a figure cloaked in black, riding a horse as black as midnight. The man's face was hidden beneath a dark mask, and his cloak billowed like a shadow in the mist. "Who goes there?" Thomas called out, his voice trembling despite his efforts to sound brave. The figure said nothing, continuing his steady approach. As he grew nearer, Thomas's heart began to pound in his chest. His hands clenched the reins of his horse, but the beast remained still, as though frozen in place. The highwayman's ghost came to a stop just a few feet away. Thomas could feel the weight of the man's presence, as though the air itself had thickened around him. There was an almost palpable coldness that seeped into his bones, and his breath came out in shallow gasps. "You are trespassing on my road," the ghostly highwayman finally spoke, his voice cold and hollow, like the wind itself. "Do you fear the darkness?" Thomas, though terrified, managed to speak. "I fear no ghost. I am a man of reason." The ghostly highwayman tilted his head slightly, as if amused by the traveler's defiance. He reached up and removed his mask, revealing a face twisted by rage and despair, eyes burning with a hatred that had not died with him. "You speak of reason, but do you understand the curse that binds me? Do you know the pain I carry?" Before Thomas could respond, the highwayman raised his hand, and a gust of wind swept through the fog, causing the lantern's flame to flicker and nearly extinguish. The temperature dropped further, and Thomas's teeth began to chatter. He tried to back away, but the road seemed to stretch endlessly in front of him, no way out. "You are not the first to encounter me," the ghost said, his voice now tinged with sorrow. "I have watched over this road for centuries, seeking justice for a life unjustly taken. And now, you will join the others who have fallen." Suddenly, the ghost's horse reared up, its eyes glowing an unnatural red. The highwayman's figure loomed over Thomas, casting a shadow that seemed to stretch far beyond the limits of the road. But then, in a moment of clarity, Thomas remembered the one thing that had been told to him about Blackthorn's curse: the highwayman could only be freed if someone was willing to take his place, to die for his cause. Without thinking, driven by a deep compassion, Thomas stepped forward. "I will carry your pain," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "I will take your place, if it means ending your suffering." The ghost paused, his gaze softening for the first time. For a fleeting moment, the air around them seemed to warm, and the mist parted slightly, allowing a glimpse of the full moon. "You would sacrifice yourself for me," the ghost whispered. Thomas nodded. "I would. If it ends your torment." There was a long silence, before the ghost slowly dismounted from his horse and handed the reins to Thomas. Then, "I am freed," the highwayman murmured. "But know this, young traveler, the curse will follow you now. You will be bound to this road, as I was, until you can find someone else willing to take your place." With that, the ghost of Blackthorn vanished into the mist, his voice fading into the night. And as the fog lifted, Thomas stood alone on the road, the weight of his decision settling over him. He now wore the mask of the highwayman, the curse passed down to him. From that night onward, the travelers who dared cross the road would find themselves face to face with a figure in black, a man whose face was hidden, and whose eyes burned with the weight of a centuries-old curse. And the legend of the ghostly highwayman would live on, now with a new chapter to tell. The road stretched out before Thomas, long and treacherous, winding its way through the desolate moors. It had been a long journey, and the cold air was starting to bite at his skin. Yet it wasn't just the chill of the night that unsettled him. There was something about this place, a sense of unease that had plagued him ever since he had entered the moors. His horse moved slowly beneath him, its hooves clopping against the rough, uneven ground. The light from his lantern barely cut through the thick fog that surrounded him, as though it were being swallowed up by the darkness. Thomas was no superstitious fool. He had heard the tales told by the villagers in hushed tones, their voices trembling as they spoke of the ghostly highwayman, the spectral rider who haunted the road. They said he had been a man, once a notorious highwayman who had terrorized travelers and merchants alike. But his life had ended in betrayal and tragedy. His soul had become bound to the road, cursed to forever roam the moors, seeking vengeance on any who crossed his path. Many believed the legend was nothing more than an old tale, told to frighten children and keep them from wandering too far at night. But as the mist thickened around him, Thomas began to wonder. There was an unsettling stillness to the air, a sense that something was watching him. His breath came out in short bursts, his heart beginning to race for reasons he could not explain. He tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself that the stories were just that, stories. But deep down, he couldn't help but feel as if something was about to happen. Suddenly, he heard a sound in the distance, faint at first but growing louder. Hooves! The sound of horses, coming fast, echoing through the fog. Thomas glanced over his shoulder, squinting into the gloom, trying to make out the source of the noise. The hooves grew louder, closer, until they seemed to surround him, filling the air with their thunderous clatter. He urged his horse forward, trying to escape the eerie sound, but it was no use. The hooves were relentless, approaching with unnatural speed. And then, through the mist, he saw him. The figure appeared suddenly, as if materializing out of the very fog itself. A man, clad in a black cloak that billowed around him like smoke, riding a massive horse that seemed to be made of shadow. His face was obscured by a dark mask, his eyes hidden beneath the deep shadow of his hood. His presence was imposing, almost otherworldly, and Thomas felt a chill crawl up his spine as the figure drew near. "Who goes there?" Thomas called out, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound confident. His heart pounded in his chest, and he tightened his grip on the reins. The figure did not respond. He simply rode forward, his horse's hooves striking the earth with eerie precision, as though they were in perfect sync with the beat of Thomas's racing heart. The rider's gaze was fixed ahead, his attention seemingly directed not at Thomas but at something else, something far beyond the mortal world. Thomas's horse snorted and skittered nervously, as though sensing the danger in the air. The fog swirled around them, thickening, obscuring everything but the dark figure and the oppressive silence that now hung between them. The air felt colder, and Thomas's breath came out in visible puffs. His skin prickled with the feeling of being watched, scrutinized by an unseen presence. The rider finally spoke, his voice like a whisper carried on the wind, distant and hollow. "Do you fear the darkness, traveler?" Thomas froze. The words were not threatening, but they were chilling nonetheless. There was something about the voice, something ancient and mournful, as though it carried with it the weight of centuries of pain and suffering. His mouth went dry, and he forced himself to speak, his voice shaky but defiant. "I fear no ghost," Thomas said. "I am a man of reason. A scholar." The rider's head tilted slightly, as if considering this. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The fog around them deepened, swirling like a living thing, and Thomas's lantern flickered wildly, casting strange, dancing shadows on the ground. The eerie silence pressed down on him, making the air feel thick, suffocating. "I was once a man of reason, too," the rider murmured, his voice laden with regret. "But that was before the curse, before the betrayal. Before she left me." The last words were spoken with such sorrow, such quiet agony, that Thomas felt a pang of empathy stir in his chest. But even as he felt sympathy for this ghostly figure, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He could sense the darkness that had consumed this man, could feel the years of torment and rage that radiated from him. "You are not the first to travel this road, nor will you be the last," the rider continued, his tone darkening. "I am bound to this place, condemned to ride for all eternity, seeking justice for a life unjustly taken. I cannot rest. I cannot die." The fog thickened even further, wrapping around them like a blanket, until Thomas could barely see the outline of the rider in front of him. The air grew colder still, biting into his skin, and his breath was now a mist before him. He felt a sudden pressure, as though the very weight of the rider's sorrow was pressing down on him. "What happened to you?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Despite the terror creeping into his heart, he couldn't help but ask. The rider's pain was palpable, and Thomas felt drawn to understand it. The rider's head turned, slowly, his eyes glowing faintly beneath his hood. "I was betrayed," he said, his voice low and full of venom. "By the one I loved most. Eleanor. She sold me out to the soldiers. The ones who took my life." Thomas's heart skipped a beat. He had heard the name before, the legend of Blackthorn. The highwayman who had terrorized the land, and whose life had been cut short by a cruel betrayal. The tale of a man who had been cursed to ride forever, seeking vengeance for the love that had betrayed him. And now, standing before him, Thomas realized that this was no mere legend. This was the ghost of Blackthorn, the highwayman who had become a specter of rage and sorrow. "You seek vengeance," Thomas said, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "But what of peace? What if there is a way to end your suffering?" The rider's gaze softened for a moment, his eyes flickering with something akin to hope. "I seek vengeance," he whispered. "But I have also sought peace. For centuries, I have ridden, hoping that one day, someone would take my place, someone willing to end my torment." Thomas's blood ran cold as the weight of the rider's words sank in. He knew what he had to do. The legends had spoken of it. The only way to break the curse was for someone to take the highwayman's place, to die in his stead. "I will take your place," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. "I will carry your pain, your burden. Let me end your suffering." The rider looked at him, his eyes filled with both sorrow and gratitude. "You would do this? You would sacrifice yourself?" Thomas nodded. "I will. If it means freeing you." The rider dismounted from his horse, the figure towering over Thomas as he held out the reins, offering them to the scholar. The weight of the moment hung in the air, thick with the gravity of the decision. And with a final, mournful sigh, the rider spoke. "Then, the curse passes to you," he said, his voice full of quiet acceptance. "You will roam this road, bound to its darkness, until you can find someone else to take your place." With that, the rider faded into the mist, his figure disappearing as though he had never been. And in his place, Thomas stood alone, the reins of the spectral horse now in his hands. The fog began to lift, and the road stretched out before him, dark and empty. But Thomas knew that his journey had just begun. He now wore the mask of the highwayman, and he would ride the moors for eternity, seeking anyone to take the curse from him. The legend of Blackthorn would live on, with a new chapter to tell, the tale of the ghostly highwayman, forever bound to the road, and the scholar who had become the next rider of the cursed path. The road was eerily silent after the rider vanished, leaving only the oppressive fog and the weight of Thomas's decision pressing down on him. His heart pounded in his chest as he stood at the crossroads of fate, his hands trembling as they clutched the reins of the spectral horse. The ghostly figure of Blackthorn had passed his curse onto him, and now Thomas found himself bound to the same destiny, a prisoner of the fog and the moors. A strange, haunting sensation lingered in the air, as if the land itself was aware of the shift that had just occurred. He stood motionless for a long moment, the stillness of the night seeming to stretch endlessly around him. The lantern in his hand flickered once, casting shadows that danced wildly across the ground. He could hear the distant howl of a wolf, its mournful cry carrying through the thick mist, but it was as if he was no longer truly a part of the world he had once known. The curse had already begun to work its way into his soul. As Thomas looked around, he realized that the road seemed different now. The path before him stretched on indefinitely, no longer a simple trail but a living entity that seemed to twist and stretch in unnatural directions, as though it had a mind of its own. The fog parted briefly, only to close in again, swallowing everything in its path. The landscape had become distorted, and there was no sign of life, no sound, no movement. The world felt suspended, trapped in an endless loop of darkness. He couldn't help but think of the village, of the people he had left behind. They had been so kind to him, even if they spoke of him in whispers behind his back, cautioning him about the dangers of the moors and the curse that haunted this road. Thomas had thought their fears were unfounded, just old wives' tales meant to keep travelers from straying too far from the safety of the village. Now, as he stood on the cursed path himself, he understood the horror they had felt. His first instinct was to flee, to turn his back on the road and seek safety in the village. But the thought quickly faded. The very air around him seemed to push against him, urging him to stay. The path was no longer his to choose. He had already made his decision when he had agreed to take Blackthorn's place. Thomas mounted the black horse, feeling its cold flesh beneath him, its muscles twitching as if it, too, was aware of the curse now binding them both. As he took the reins, the world around him seemed to come alive, the mist swirling and swirling, rising higher and higher until it formed a solid wall of fog that blocked his vision entirely. There was no longer any sense of time, only the oppressive darkness and the faint, ethereal glow of the moon that struggled to break through the clouds above. He rode for what felt like hours, though he couldn't be sure. The road was winding, endless, as though the moors themselves had twisted into an infinite loop. Every time he thought he saw an end, a clearing, a way out, the path stretched further, bending away into more fog. The sensation of being trapped gnawed at him, the same way the rider's sorrow had gnawed at his soul. He was no longer just Thomas, the scholar from the village. He had become something else, something that no longer belonged to the realm of the living. And then, in the distance, he saw it, the figure of another rider, cloaked in black, riding toward him through the fog. The heart of Thomas, or whatever remained of him, skipped a beat. The fog parted, and the rider emerged, his horse's hooves striking the ground with a rhythm that matched the racing beat of Thomas's heart. This new figure was unlike any Thomas had seen before. His face was hidden beneath the shadow of a hood, his body draped in tattered robes that seemed to sway in the windless air. But there was something unsettling about him, something different. His eyes, though hidden in the darkness of his hood, seemed to glow with an unnatural light, an ancient, piercing gaze that saw through the very fabric of existence. The new rider stopped just in front of Thomas, their horses standing side by side. The air grew heavier as the figure spoke, his voice low and deep, as if it were a part of the earth itself. "You have taken the curse," the rider said, his voice thick with ancient knowledge. "You will now understand the road as I once did." Thomas tried to speak, but no words would come. His mouth felt dry, his throat tight with fear and confusion. He had expected to be alone on this road, bound by the curse, but now, in this place, in this new reality, it seemed there were others who had taken the same path before him. The road was not just Blackthorn's to haunt. It was the domain of all those who had ever worn the mantle of the Highwayman, those who had been cursed and bound to the moors for eternity. "You are not the first," the new rider continued, his voice still resonating with that deep, otherworldly power. "There are many of us now, cursed to ride the fog, to haunt the road. We are all bound by the same fate, by the same sorrow. Each of us once sought justice. Each of us has failed." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Thomas's heart twisted with an emotion he could not name, pity, perhaps, or terror. The rider's words resonated deeply with him. They were true. He had sought to help Blackthorn, to end his suffering, but in doing so, he had unknowingly taken on the same burden. Now, he was no better than the ghost he had freed. "The curse cannot be undone," the rider spoke again, his eyes now gleaming in the darkness. "There is no salvation. There is no peace for those who take this path. You will ride forever, bound by the sins of your past and the weight of your choices. The road is endless. You will ride it, just as I have, just as Blackthorn did, until the end of time." The rider raised a hand, gesturing toward the fog. Slowly, Thomas's gaze followed the movement. In the distance, he saw the faint outline of other riders' figures cloaked in black, their faces hidden beneath hoods, their horses moving with the same eerie precision. They were all around him now, circling like vultures, their presence both a comfort and a threat. Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to tremble, and the fog thickened even further, swallowing the riders in its embrace. The voices of the other highwaymen began to fade, replaced by the sound of hooves pounding the earth in unison. The riders moved as one, an eternal procession that stretched on into infinity. Thomas tried to speak again, but no words came out. The curse had fully taken hold of him, and he understood now what Blackthorn had meant when he said that the only way to end the torment was for someone else to take his place. This was not a curse that could be broken. It was a cycle, one that would continue for eternity, passed from one soul to the next, each rider more broken than the last. With a final, mournful glance at the fading figures around him, Thomas urged his horse forward, joining the endless procession. The road stretched on forever, twisting and winding through the fog, an endless loop of sorrow and regret. And so, the legend of the ghostly highwayman grew even more tragic, for now Thomas was one of them, lost to the fog, bound to the road, and forever haunted by the choices he had made. He would ride the moors, never to be free, as Blackthorn had once written, until the day when another soul would take his place, and the cycle would continue. The end.